Stead, we're live.
And that's the great voice. It gets more and more enthusiastic all the time from Larry, the Liberty guy. Thanks, Larry. Good to have you back in the saddle. Boy, I had to do that show yesterday without you. You helped us remotely. You were in Florida, but yet you helped us get the show launched. I don't know how you did it, how work your magic from down there, but it's good to have you back in our virtual studio helping us out today. All right, we just welcome.
That's what you pay me the big bucks for, right?
Yeah,
so,
the big bucks. That's
right.
for sure. All right, welcome back in the Dugout. I'm your host, Mike Stenhouse. I'm wearing a cap today. Probably haven't worn before. It says TMS on it. Quogue. TMS, 10-man suite. That's 10 roommates. We were in a suite at Harvard, and we get together every year at one of my roommates' big giant mansion houses in Quogue, which is in Long Island. Right on the beach, and it's our annual event. Of course, we didn't have it last year in the midst of COVID. We're scheduled to have it this year, but I got to tell you, all the things we're talking about today and we talked about yesterday have already caused some people to back out from our group. Others are still considering whether to go. But this is how, while many of us have resumed out of the house activities, restaurants, maybe sporting events, outdoor sporting events. Some of us are more liberal about it than others. An event like this, I'm not sure if it's going to happen. I don't know. So it's just, how this has affected our lives so much. And as you heard yesterday, and as you're going to hear today when Dr. Bostom joins us, so much of it is based on a narrative that is not true. But it's a narrative that sinks in people's minds, affects their decision-making, affects how we live our lives, whether or not groups like me and my roommates get together or not. And all we want is for honesty and transparency. And then we'll make our own decisions. But we had a long call last night with my roommate group, and some people believe the lies the government tells them. Some people like me don't, and we can't agree on anything. Right? Among friends, close, dear blood brother friends. Because the media, the government, the medical establishment have put out so much misinformation. And of course, the irony is those who fight against the misinformation by big tech, they're the ones who are labeled misinformation. It's really an amazing phenomenon. What you're going to hear, I think, from Dr. Bostom in just a few minutes will reinforce your distrust of what this government, at least in this state, is telling you. Because Dr. Bostom has evidence that will show you that it's very likely that this government has been deceiving you purposely and knowingly, despite the data that it has in its own possession. Next week, we're going to get back and start talking a little bit more about critical race theory in schools. Schools will have started. We're going to start getting anecdotes from parents about hearing what's going on in their kids' classrooms. Maybe we'll get some from more teachers. I don't know. But we're going to have a guest on. There's a group in North Kingston actually leading a recall of a school committee member, actually a student-initiated recall of a Marxist school committee member who's pushing critical race theory, pushing defund the police stuff, and trying to indoctrinate the kids, who actually betrayed the students of North Kingston High School. And the kids pushed back. They started a recall position. It's really picked up steam. We're going to tell you about that next week, so stay in. All right, a quick little batting practice, which just means a few other events before we get to the our major guest today, Dr. Andrew Bostom. And again, remember our theme, To This We've Come. Go to oceanstatecurrent.com, click on the tab at the top, Arias for Freedom, and listen to the tremendous aria with the video and the words To this we've come, sung by Claire Stoutmuller, who we're going to have back on the show again very soon. But it's a theme. It's like, to this we've come. I can't believe these things are happening. That's what it means. I can't believe that this is happening. Yesterday's show on this gubernatorial executive order that not only put more quarantine and isolation mandates on people, actually now putting testing mandates on people who might have been exposed to someone. Before, we just kind of asked people, I mean, recently, please be self-aware, self-quarantine, self-isolate if you've been around somebody. That's fair advice for a government to give. But now they've crossed the line again, and they're mandating that anyone who the Department of Health has determined has been in contact with someone recently diagnosed with a positive test will have to take a test. And the real kicker is, if the Department of Health determines you haven't been properly quarantining, isolating, or testing per the new executive order, they have carte blanche, the term any action, quote, any action has been authorized by this governor to the Department of Health to punish you if you're found violating one of these new quarantine, isolation, or testing mandates. Outrageous. The Department of Health as law enforcement, judge, jury, and executioner. Are you kidding me? Much more on this. Watch yesterday's show, September 2nd. Is that the right day? Yeah, September 2nd. Watch yesterday's show. I mean, I was not a happy camper, and I let you know about it. And I'm still not happy, but I'm not going to get into it all again. All right, a few other miscellaneous things, one national, one local. You know, we got we got a lousy job report this morning nationally. Only 235,000 jobs added. Analysts were expecting 3 times that many, over 3 times that many. And Biden and the left try to tell us that these harsh masking and vaccine mandates are going to help our economy. Well, businesses have been requiring vaccines, the government's been requiring vaccines, and it's not helping our economy. It's not helping our economy. So I show you that not just because of the failure of Biden's, he economic policy, but he's trying to say that his COVID policies are helping the economy. Clearly, they have not. Clearly, with this horrid jobs report today, Biden's COVID policies are also failing because they're not stopping. I mean, we've had a little recent downturn, but they're killing the economy. And here's one, Valley Breeze, that has one of its opinion writers, Erica Sanzi. She's part of Parents Defending Education. We had the CEO of that group on, as you may recall, last month as a guest. But again, it's just part of this theme, schools deliberately deceiving parents. Now, she's talking about something a little different than the mandates and the data, but still, this is the theme, right? This is the theme we see. A government and a school system and health officials that are deceiving, perhaps even lying, certainly hiding information from the people. And it's because they know they're advancing unpopular, unproven, politically extreme agendas. So they have to deceive, they have to hide, they have to lie. Let me tell you the consequence of some of that. So I'm going to tell, before we bring on Dr. Bostom, I just want to tell you one story. It's from a mom who contacted me this morning. Yesterday was the first day of school for her child. I'm not going to give out names, locations, anything like that. But I'll just say it was under high school, right? A young child. I guess a lot of the schools, you line up 3 feet apart before you enter the classroom, and the teacher makes sure you have a face covering. Well, in this case, the mom had made her own face covering. Looked a little nicer than that ugly blue thing. She studied what would make it at least as compliant as those blue things. So she put in the materials, and the child was in line. She gets to the door. The teacher pulls her out of line, rips the mask off her, hands her the blue thing, and says, you have to wear this. That other mask is not adequate. And the mask your mother made for you is not adequate. Now, you're a young child. You're singled out. You're pulled out of line. Your mother's mask is ripped off you. You're given this other thing to wear. And the kid, of course, starts crying, as you would expect a young kid to do, who's been singled out in front of their classmates like this. Now, there's a lot to the story. I'm going to tell you a little bit more of it. So she was not allowed into her classroom until she put on what the teacher said was a better mask. Now, first of all, what medical expertise does this teacher have to make a judgment that this mask that the mother made, trying to be compliant with at least the blue mask level, what level of expertise did that teacher have to make that judgment and embarrass that kid? To this we've come. None, obviously. And this was confirmed later because the parent talked to the principal of that school, who was very reasonable about this, I should say. And that principal agreed the teacher had no medical experience to justify making a judgment like that. The principal agreed. But yet to this we've come. This is what happened. But it gets worse than that. The mask they were given, and the principal again admitted this to the parent, on the box provided to the schools by the Department of Health, those blue masks. On the box, it clearly says, these masks do not prevent the spread of airborne viruses and disease. Are you kidding me? But yet this is the mask that everyone says is going to save people's lives. The principal admitted that to the mom. Yes, we agree that the box says that, but it's what the state mandates. Do you see how nonsensical this all is? So the child, who isn't in a position to make such a judgment, had to make a judgment. Do I put on this mask my mom didn't give me and go into the classroom, or don't I go into the classroom? So of course the child complied and had to wear that mask the whole length of the day, 6, 7, 8 hours, whatever that is. The parent then talked to the principal. Principal is very understanding, admitted those things, admitted the teacher had no medical right or experience to make such a judgment, that mask that was given to them, given to that child, was no better than the mask that the mom had made for that child. And apparently that child will be going back to school today, allowed to wear the mother's mask. But to this we've come, where these tyrants, not just in government, but in schools, well, I guess you could say that public school teachers are government employees. But to this we've come, where people are just empowering themselves, like we've always said, think they know best. And the final piece of this story is, is the mother made the mask for her daughter because she's concerned, and we're going to ask Dr. Bostom about this when he joins us in just a moment. But the mother is concerned about, an element called graphene that's apparently in these blue masks, and that she claims, I don't know the truth of it, and that's why we'll ask Dr. Bostom, but she claims that those blue masks with that graphene element is actually quite harmful to kids, especially when you wear a mask wear such a mask for long periods of time, like in a whole school day. Where she had felt she had made a much safer 100% compliant mask of her own. So to this we've come, and it just goes on and on and on. Okay, so joining us now is your favorite, my favorite COVID-19 expert, Dr. Andy Bostom. Andy, welcome back to In the Dugout. How you doing?
Thanks for having me on again, Mike.
All right, in just a few minutes, we're gonna get with Andy on some data he's uncovered, some other studies. Of course, this is what he does. Andy is an epidemiologist. He's a researcher, though. He researches data on these and other issues. So we're going to look into some of that research. We're going to look into some data he's obtained from the state. Very, that pretty much proves the state and the Department of Health has been deceiving people, as I talked about in my opening comments. But before we get into that, Doc, you know, I just told the story of the parent whose daughter was pulled out of line, forced to switch masks by a teacher who has no medical way to judge masks. I mean, we've been talking about this ad nauseum about how crazy these mask mandates. We're going to talk about a personal situation with you, not from a research point of view, but as a parent. What are these regulations doing to people?
I think they're dividing people. They're certainly not protecting people. They're frightening people. It's the opposite of what public epidemiology and public health is supposed to be about. You know, if the Hippocratic Oath can be boiled down to, you know, above all, do no harm, its epidemiologic equivalent would be above all, cause no panic. These infectious diseases and other health situations cause enough anxiety and stress and at times hysteria on their own. You don't add fuel to that fire as a public health official and epidemiologist.
That's such a great point. I mean, you know, public policy, public health officials should be there to reassure the people, to provide them with the confidence that they're going to get through this. But like so much of the left-wing agenda, it pits one group of people against another group of people, whether it's taxing the rich so we can give it to less fortunate people, whether it's affirmative action policies that favor one race of people over another race of people. It's constantly critical race theory. It's constantly pitting one group of people against another because they believe in special group rights. They believe in special interest rights. They believe that they know best, where our country is based on individual freedom and individual rights, not group rights.
Well, Mike, the pressure is coming. It's a top-down, bottoms-up thing at this point.
Right.
So the pressure is coming from the top too.
Right.
And it's eerily similar to me, having read about it, of what the Soviets did with Lysenko. Lysenko was an agronomist who had some very unorthodox and ultimately disproven theories about agronomy and about plant genetics, and yet he was Stalin's favorite, and he was able to enforce his dogma, and with of course with the assistance of Stalin, who controlled the state. Scientists who disagreed with Lysenko, particularly as his experiments were failing in real time and contributed to the Soviet terror famine in the Ukraine, scientists who disagreed with him were literally sent to the gulag. And so we're seeing this now. For example, to me, the classic Lysenkoism that we're dealing with right now, masks is sort of a subdivision of that, would be this erasure of natural immunity, as if it doesn't exist anymore.
Well, we're going to get into that.
So that would be classic Lysenkoism, Mike.
But you're so right in what you first said. You know, this is the difference between the left and the right. The left believes in top-down government control over our lives, whether we like it or not. And we on the right tend to believe, let individuals inform them, leave them to make the best decisions for their lives, which and that's our name, freedom and prosperity. The more freedom you have, the more prosperous and happy we'll be. I believe in that. And by the way, those centrally planned communist 5-year plans didn't work out too well, did they? Way back when. So
No, when you have sham science upholding them,
right.
it only makes situations worse.
Which is what we're going to get into, we think is going on here. But I want to stay on this personal story. We talked about this mom and her daughter being pulled out of line because of her mask by some unknowing teacher. You've had something similar happen in your story. I want to show this picture to
Okay.
our audience. Now, this is your son. And he was, well, tell the story. He's got a wristband on.
Right. So
what is
so
that wristband all about?
He was reporting back as a sophomore to his major Northeastern University, and he had written a very good letter. I helped him, but it was basically his about why he didn't want to get vaccinated and why he felt he didn't need to be vaccinated. Chief among his reasons was the fact that he'd had an asymptomatic infection, apparently, Mike, and never tested positive, but generated a very robust antibody profile with a big titer of spike anti-spike antibodies, which is exactly what you get from the vaccine. Plus, because I was curious, given the nature of how asymptomatic he was, it turned out he had evidence of T-cell immunity on the one emergency use authorization test that the FDA has approved.
And you tested for that as well.
Yeah, so he had T-cell immunity. So he said, look, I really don't need the vaccine. I think I have a very strong immunity, including T-cell immunity. Plus, I'm in the age group where the risk for myocarditis is not trivial, and being previously infected may even augment that risk. So I really don't want to be vaccinated. And they accepted it, although they didn't classify it as a medical exemption, Mike. They just threw it in the category of general exemptions.
But yet they made him wear a wristband. Why?
Exactly. In other words, they would not confer upon him what he deserves, which is that he has at least as robust an immunity as any kid that wasn't previously infected that got vaccinated, and probably very little different than a kid who got infected and did get vaccinated, because we'll see some of the data from Rhode Island about that.
All right. Before we go there, another major Northeastern university, this one by name, University of Rhode Island. The governor held a press conference down there yesterday with the college president, and they were lauding the mandate. Not only earlier they had mandated students, now they're mandating all faculty and staff. This has a little bit of maybe of a silver lining to it. I mean, I put a tweet out.
This is good. I'm really surprised.
Yeah.
So this isn't.
First of all, it's a mandate, but they're not really being sticklers apparently on this religious mandate. If you claim a religious mandate, you just have to check a box. You don't have to go into and explain your whole life story.
Right, but I guess, first of all, I heard the press or parts of it as much as I could stomach the other day that was held at URI, and they were talking about extraordinarily high vaccination rates, like I think over 90% amongst the students. So, I guess they feel it's not going to affect the pool of vaccinated people very much anyway. But I wonder what what the additional testing requirements and everything else are for these kids, and how segregated they're going to be. So I don't know.
Yeah, it was so weird. I mean, it's not cynical. It's true. I mean, to see the media, to see the government, the governor, the Department of Health, and all the university people cheering these mandates, literally cheering.
Right. It's
this infringement on our liberties.
Quite chilling, but especially when it's combined with this really grotesque form of anti-science dogma too.
All right, and as we've been discussing with parent groups, and as you and I have been discussing, the original gubernatorial mandate for school mask mandates was refined by the Department of Health just a few days ago or last week, which basically meant a town like Gloucester, who would put in some exemptions, was no longer authorized to do that. They really restricted and put these mandates. So with that as the backdrop, Doctor, there's no justification for this hysteria in K through 12 schools, because tell us what you know about the level of pediatric hospitalizations in Rhode Island and in New England.
Yeah, the entire summer. So the Health and Human Services has a web portal which updates once or twice a day, even at least once a day during the weekdays. And I think it actually is running on the weekend, so you can access it anytime you want. And they won't separate the hospitalizations out because of COVID or just testing positive with COVID. So it is sort of larded with an excess number of hospitalizations that way. However, they will at least confirm, so you have confirmed, in other words, which means a positive test. At least doesn't tell you whether the primary admission was because of COVID, but at least it tells you there's COVID admissions related with a positive test. And that number, I've been tracking it very closely for the last 2 weeks, has basically been 0 to a maximum of 2 in the whole state of Rhode Island, confirmed hospitalizations with COVID in the teeth of the Delta wave, which was supposed to be worse for kids. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics has been very deficient in this campaign, and have issued all kinds of, I think, anti-scientific sort of guidelines. However, even they concede
the American College of Pediatricians or
the
the
American
other
Academy,
pediatricians?
the American Academy of Pediatricians.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
American Academy of Pediatricians, which is the mainstream organization.
Which is not Michelle Cretella's group. Okay.
Oh no. But it's an immense organization. Hers is a very small organization. And their head of their infectious disease committee grudgingly acknowledged that there's no difference in terms of hospitalizations for the Delta variant versus the earlier the original Wuhan strain or the UK Alpha variant. In other words, it's the same very benign disease in otherwise healthy kids.
So we is it true that with the Delta variant, there might be more pediatric cases, just like there might be with the flu?
Yeah. I mean, if you were to look at the whole range of the whole gamut of infections, including the totally asymptomatic, yeah, maybe there's a few more. It is a little more infectious, but his point was that it's the same benign disease basically in children, a disease that's much less virulent than the flu, including seasonal flu, and for the really young kids, less than 5, much less virulent than respiratory syncytial virus. So, for example, we don't get this kind of transparency, unfortunately, from our CDC, but its equivalent, called Public Health England, recently tracked respiratory syncytial virus hospitalizations versus COVID hospitalizations, and of course they went through their Delta wave, and the RSV hospitalizations in this younger group of kids was 10 times higher. So, but the idea that COVID is mercifully a relatively benign disease in children, other than children with profound developmental disabilities, is holding up through the Delta variant.
All right. Now you sent me some info or this chart. So again, there is. So based on what you just said, if I were to really boil it down, and maybe even, no, I don't even think I'm overstating it, there is no emergency problem with kids in schools right now, right?
Absolutely not. Absolutely
not. But yet
the other thing is, Mike, it'd be nice if we could show this one time, maybe not today, but there's a very nice website that the CDC does maintain. And what it does, and it updates not quite as often as that others as the Health and Human Services site. It tracks diagnostically confirmed COVID emergency department visits. And I've been working with a lot of data analysts from something called Rational Ground, and they've been following this measure for the entire course of the pandemic. And it has predicted the rise and fall of each one of these waves very, very accurately. It's sort of a bellwether measure. And that measure has peaked over for both pediatric and adult hospitalizations in not only in the state of Rhode Island, but in all of New England and all of the United States in terms of this Delta wave. So it's a good, now there are a few states which are exceptions to this that haven't quite, reached their peak and, or let alone are
You
not quite on the way
you
down.
feel that we're generally on the downslope now.
Well, at
Okay.
least according to this measure, which is
All
a
right.
pretty good indicator.
All right, the issue right now for kids is school mask mandates. Parents are outraged. We talked about the mother whose daughter was plucked out of line because the teacher didn't think the mask was sufficient. So let's talk about masking kids. You sent me this data not too long ago. It's a study about the effect of masking. So why don't you take us through this and tell me where you want me to point?
Yeah, this is the one that people like Megan Ranney and all the sort of mask totalitarians were just jumping for joy over this study. It was a study done in villages in Bangladesh. It was a huge study. It was about over 340,000 people. And they randomized them to two different forms of masks: paper masks, surgical masks, or cloth masks, versus whatever the other communities were doing. And they did have a small background rate of some form of mask usage, but it was part of it's a perfectly reasonable sort of randomization. But the bottom line is, Mike, that the cloth masks were absolutely useless. The absolute risk reduction between the two groups
right here
was 0.02%.
right here. So they're virtually identical to that, and that's compared to no mask.
And that's compared to just whatever the villages were doing, basically.
Right,
in other words, they didn't have instruction, they didn't have formal introduction of masks. They just did whatever they were doing, and their background rate was lower. Their mask usage was lower.
Now I see down here that surgical masks had a little bit better effect.
Right. But the point is that it was still 0.09%. The absolute reduction was 0.09. That's 9 in 10,000, Mike.
Right.
And then when you look at where it's coming from, it's only coming from people for some bizarre reason, and people who are 50 and above. There's no benefit in people who are less than 50 years old. And this is actually kind of strange. And of course, it doesn't support masking children in school.
Right, because this study was about adults 50 and over, and the government was using this study to justify why kids should be masked, even though we show right here, the younger you get, there's no impact to masking.
Absolutely. And the effects are so tiny. It takes a study that's as massive as this, almost 350,000 people, to show even these minuscule, clinically meaningless kind of differences in one type of mask. And by the way, there's still a tremendous amount of cloth mask usage throughout this country. People don't like the paper masks. They kind of have a funny smell, and but the bottom line is those paper masks are. I mean, it's a clinically meaningless difference in infection.
Right, so let's summarize. Cloth masks are virtually useless.
That's right.
N95 surgical masks.
Well, not N95. These are just surgical masks.
All right, just surgical masks. The ones, all right, they minuscule effect, right? Minuscule.
Well, but
and only in older people.
Which begs the question as to whether the real effect is zero with them too, because in other words, this is sort of data dredging. They're looking at where there's an effect, and magically it's only in people 50 and above. That doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense.
So when Rhode Island Department of Health officials say that there's strong evidence that masking helps, therefore to justify their school mask mandates, you say
there isn't any evidence, including this, and beyond that, you have to look at the 12 randomized controlled trials which came before this. And by the way, this isn't published yet, but it's okay. It's a preprint. The 12 randomized controlled trials that came before this, including a big one with COVID, the Dan mask trial, found absolutely no effect. So now you're throwing in this one, which certainly, is confirmation in one sense that it didn't work with cloth masks. But even with the paper surgical masks, medical masks, the effect is so small and so bizarrely selective that you could just lump it in and say it's the 13th negative study.
All right. All right. Let's, before we move to vaccines, I just want to review with you, we've done this before. I go to this WPRI website where it lists, I just want to review the statewide data and see if any alarm bells at all from you, are ringing here. So I'm gonna go over to I think WPRI has the most user friendly. I'm waiting for it to load so I can share it. Screen here. So we know that. So sorry for this loading so slow. What's up with my computer today? But yeah, you can see a bunch of blank screens right there. Let me stop the sharing. But we have had an increase in cases somewhat. We're up into the 200, 300 per day. It's not anywhere close to the, higher hundreds, even thousands we had. Again, we know that counting cases is not really the thing to be measured. But here is the screen. Any cause for concern from your end here? And here's the chart. Are you seeing that all right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it seems as if it's leveling off, and that's the crudest. You know what? If we have a second here, Mike, I'd like to send Larry a link that maybe he can quickly display.
All right,
because I think it's a much more useful way to present the data.
All right. Well, here's deaths. We still see there are many days without deaths. Most days it's a 1 or 2 when there are. We had a couple at 4. So again, we're still not anywhere close to where we were last spring or last winter when it comes to that.
No,
hospitalizations up a little.
The problem with this, Mike, is that even with the data request, which we'll get to, they're being pressed by Senator Dela Cruz and Mike Chippendale to elaborate the with and the from. But we learned also that they have data on even death certificate data, Mike. They can determine whether COVID was the primary cause, an ancillary cause, or whether the person tested positive. And that would be really striking to look at, because that would affect the course of the entire pandemic.
Yeah, we've been asking for that data for
They have it. And it's really, you have to think about this, Mike.
Not only are they lying, Doc, but they're hiding information from us too. Right?
But the point is, they wouldn't be able to misrepresent if there was transparency. And that's the point of this whole exercise that we're going to get to. But maybe we can get back to it. I'm going to send to Larry this link that I think I think we should show it, because it's really helpful. But yeah, if you want to start getting into the data request and everything, I can.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in just a minute, just a little before that. So here's a headline from the Providence Journal. I don't know, maybe today, I think. We've been hearing for weeks that this new Delta strain and the increase in cases are the pandemic of the unvaccinated, but we pretty much know that was another false narrative.
It was a lie. Right? It was a lie. It was always a lie. And it's really, well, it's interesting, Mike. I was my eyes, open wide when you said this was from the Providence Journal, but I see it's an Associated Press story. I don't know of any reporter from the Providence Journal that would have done something like this on their own. And by the way, we can supply them with the same data. We're going to talk about it. We can supply them with the same data. But this is one of the things I want to remind you, Mike. The hostility and the incuriousness of these reporters. Yesterday I was invoked in passing again at the press conference by this cannabis clown. What is his name? Bill Bartholomew. And in a very snide and nasty way, looking for sycophantic reassurance from the Department of Health director, but poo-pooing this idea of natural immunity. And really,
yeah, we're going to get to that too in just a bit.
Right, but I'm just saying that you would think if there was any sort of pulse, any sort of healthy curiosity in the Rhode Island journalistic community, they would have been all over this data release. It's a very important data release.
Now, not only do they not ask difficult questions and fully compliant with whatever the Department of Health and the governor tell them, but like you said, they're going out of their way to try to cancel you, to cancel any other voice that is providing an alternative to that narrative. I mean, it's happening nationally, right? It's happening. So, all right. So I guess Larry got what you.
Larry, can you make this work live? Yeah, there you go. There you go. So this is the whole United States, Mike. You see how it's peaked over? If Larry can scroll it down. Okay, so that's the whole United States. Larry, can you go to Rhode Island? There's a button up there. It'll allow you where it says United States. You can replace that with Rhode Island.
Let's do it. Here we go.
Okay. It'll give it a moment to change.
There we go.
Okay, scroll down. So Rhode Island is certainly looks like the plateau. It looks like it's about to come down. But if you look at our neighbors, like look at Connecticut and Massachusetts, they've definitely peaked over. So we should be joining our neighbors, pretty soon. But it's a really, Mike and Larry, this is a very good tool for you, for the public to use. It's public access. Yeah, so this is peaked over, and this was Massachusetts. And I think you'll see pretty much the same thing for Connecticut. And we don't have to go through all the New England states, but basically, we're looking like the rest of the country in New England. It's peaked over. And what's nice about this, guys, is that it's a diagnosed COVID-19. So it sounds like it's got to be a laboratory and clinical syndrome determined in the emergency department. It's a face-to-face clinical visit.
And this trend, Doc, is what we have seen in other countries too, India, England, and all that with this variant, right?
But I'm just saying this particular measure, Mike, based on data analysts that I trust quite a bit, who've been monitoring this index for the entire course of the pandemic, accurately predicts when things are getting worse and when things are getting better.
All right.
Andy, before I find this. Before we move on, Sten, sorry to interrupt. Andy, how do people find this? I'm sorry? How do people find this tool?
Oh, yeah. So they go to, you've got the address, at the top. It's through the CDC, and it's got a long address, but it's basically United States Trends and Emergency Department Visits, and it's on the COVID data tracker page.
Beautiful, Andy. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, before we get to showing a table of data that you recently got access to and the key findings of that data, tell us about the work that you, in conjunction with some General Assembly members, have been doing.
Right, so it was actually very simple. I contacted Representative Chippendale and State Senator De La Cruz, and I asked them, I gave them just sort of a data request that was basically broken down by all the age groups that the state uses already. So I figured that would be easy for them. And it requested the infections, the hospitalizations, and the deaths broken down by those age categories, but then further differentiated, Mike, by whether the person was vaccinated. Now, I wanted partially vaccinated, fully vaccinated, unvaccinated. They love to do this. They only lump together the unvaccinated and partially vaccinated.
Yep.
But what they did do, which was dramatic and which really drove the whole analysis, as you'll see, or not analysis, but just the data, is they also provided information about prior infection. Now, I'll give them credit to a certain extent, but I also don't look at how they sent this to lay people who didn't even understand it when they first sent it. I was like thrilled, and they were like, well, I don't know if we got what you requested. And look at what they're calling repeat positive greater than 90 days, Mike. Instead, so they have to be cryptic about it. Instead of telling these lay people, That means they had a prior infection, and calling that row prior infection, that's a repeat positive greater than 90 days. And you had to read the definition and everything. It just, again, first positive is okay. That's pretty clear, but I mean, please just tell them it's a prior infection.
All right. So before
anyway,
we get into the key takeaways, again, I just want to make clear that this data was obtained with your advice, but obtained by what, Representative Mike Chippendale and Senator Jessica De La Cruz. Is that correct?
As both Mike and Jessica explained to me, it's they requested the data. They're entitled to see the data, but they're public data, and they're more than entitled, given my role, in turning it over to me. Because I was wondering, well, look, maybe I'm not supposed to share this or something. And they said, absolutely not. We work on your behalf, and these are public data. And so, okay, well, I was very happy.
All right, so I want to so we want to make sure we give them credit, because
Absolutely.
So they obtained this data through a legislative request, not through a public records request like a layperson would have to do. Who knows how much they would have charged somebody, all right, a layperson for this, right?
Exactly.
So, how many hundreds or thousands
now
of
to
dollars.
get more granular on it, I think they are going to have to go that route. In other words, we wanted more information on comorbidities and breaking down the hospitalizations further so we could determine because or with.
All right, so I want to set a theme before we get into analyzing these numbers, which are going to show properly. I want to know, there's two reasons that I want to publicize this and discuss it with you.
Okay.
A, for its face value. B, to show, well, three reasons. B, to show that, which I think you'll agree, that the government, if you look at this data, it doesn't match what the government's been telling us, right?
Not at all.
So I want to make sure we stress that every chance we can. And C, I'm hoping this compels the General Assembly to take action, because only they or a judge or a high court, which is going to require a lot of legal effort, as we discussed on my show yesterday, where I really railed against this recent declared state of emergency and all these mask mandate and other executive orders that have emanated from that. We're trying to urge the General Assembly to take control, to exercise their constitutional and legal duty, and to intervene against the governor's bogus declared state of emergency. So keep that in mind, that we're trying to convince.
I'll give you a fourth,
right?
That's urgent, Mike. I'll give you a fourth that's urgent.
Yep.
It affects the healthcare workers in this state. The
That too.
healthcare
Well,
workers,
yep.
the healthcare workers and the EMTs and the firemen, that at least a portion of whom now are very leery of getting vaccinated. When the rest of us were, hiding in place or whatever the hell they called it, they were out there dealing with all the emergencies, medical and non-medical.
Yeah, agree. That's the fourth, and that's
and
out
many
there
of them
too.
got infected, Mike, and many
Right.
of them got infected, and they need to have their natural immunity recognized if that's their main reason for not wanting to get vaccinated.
Well, yeah, but I agree. So it's not just, it's all the mandates, the school mask mandate, the healthcare worker mandate, all those mandates go away if the declared state of emergency is overridden by the General Assembly.
No, I get it. That's the bigger picture.
Okay.
But this is a particularly nasty issue. They're firing these folks.
Yeah, I know. All right. So let's look at the takeaways from that table of data we just looked at. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay. So this is how I wanted to summarize it for the public, for the representatives who are kind enough and tenacious enough to get the information out for the public. So what I wanted to do was compare. First of all, I was struck, and this is July, remember, Mike? I mean, the data request has already gone in for the August data, since we're now in September. And I was struck, despite the propaganda, 30% of all new infections, regardless of vaccination status, occurred in regardless of being previously infected or not, occurred in those who were vaccinated. 30% in July, Mike. That's July. The phenomenon that we're looking at,
otherwise known as a breakthrough case.
Absolutely. The phenomenon that we're looking at that's contributing to this 30% is vaccine waning. We know, with the data from Israel are very clear now, and that's why they've already triple
Meaning
vaccinated.
the effect, the efficacy of the vaccine
It wears off over
wanes
time. It wears off. It wears off over time.
6 months,
Well,
maybe.
pardon?
6 months, maybe.
Well within 6 months. Yeah,
All right.
earlier in some people.
All right.
But well within 6 months, and that's why they're mandating boosters now in Israel every 6 months, or at least.
All right.
they've
Back to the
started
data.
process.
Back to the data.
Back to the data. So 30% of all the new infections, but 29% of the infections occurred among those that were fully vaccinated with no prior history of infection. So they were pretty much the same. However, only 3.4%. And when we say infections, remember, Mike, we're talking about positive tests. They could be at, wildly high cycle thresholds, which are clinically meaningless, but that it is what it is. Only 3.4% of those unvaccinated or partially vaccinated, which they lump together, but previously infected, got reinfected. And that number, this is interesting, Mike, that number stayed constant at 3.4%. If you go up to point number 3, that number stayed constant at 3.4%, regardless of vaccination status. So in other words, vaccinating a person that was previously infected didn't drop that number at all. At all. In other words, it didn't drop it from 3.4 to 1% or 2%.
All right, so let's stop right there, because
Sure.
one thing we've heard, I heard Director Scott say it yesterday, and at every press conference, at least some people, I think it's been Pat Ford, has been asking, if you've previously been infected, do you still need a vaccination? And they have said, yes, natural immunity is not enough. You still need a vaccine if you want to be fully protected. Yet the data they have themselves,
that's right,
shows that is not the case.
Well, so far, again, this is a snapshot in time.
Okay,
This is the month of July, but it's not a trivial number of infections. You're talking, can we go back to that? It's not a trivial number of infections. It's not a trivial number of infections. It's over 2,100 infections. And so the point is that when you look at this in its totality, as I summarized, recovery from natural infection in Rhode Island during July 2021 was 8.5 times more protective against new infection relative to full vaccination. I mean, and by the way, Mike, this particular point is very consistent with a huge data set from Israel, one of its largest HMOs, which found that ratio was about 7-fold in terms of preventing infections.
So according to that big Israeli study, this snapshot in Rhode Island, more evidence, I'll leave it up to you to say proof, but more evidence that natural immunity far more effective than vaccine immunity. Right, this snapshot, right?
Well, and in this case, we're confined to just positive tests. I think this 3.4% is a high number relative to what it would be if you really defined a clinical infection. It might but the relative relationship, the 8.5-fold is very consistent with what the Israelis found. If they just looked at positive tests, I think they went as high as 13-fold. But it's a snapshot, and it's comparable to a much larger data set. That's my whole point.
Right. So those are strong indicators. All right, let's go to points 4 and 5 about hospitalization.
Yeah, and I want a couple of caveats is that this is where it's probably going to take an APRA request, Mike. They have the data, but they wouldn't sort out the because of versus with, which they have, which they've given little snippets of even to Matt Allen, by the way, informally. The legislators want this formally now, and they want it to become part of the formal reporting. But be that as it may, without being able to distinguish whether it was just a positive test or it was a true admission because of COVID, I found this very interesting too. 18.8% of the COVID hospitalizations occurred among those fully vaccinated during July. This is not one. Remember what they were saying? Less than 1%, some fraction of a percent, et cetera. 18 point. However, only 12.5%, at least relative to that, of the hospitalizations occurred among those unvaccinated but with a prior infection history. So
again, this is a question of natural immunity versus vaccinated immunity, right?
Exactly.
The same question, right?
Exactly. And so once again, you can say, just summarizing these two data points, that recovery from natural infection in Rhode Island during July was 150% more protective against new COVID hospitalization relative to full vaccination.
So again, natural immunity seems to prevent not only the incident of cases, as we talked earlier, but also the incident of severe adverse effects that lead to hospitalization.
Right, and the caveats are that we can't really separate out because of or with, and that this is a very small sample of hospitalizations. 96 hospitalizations is not a lot. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that you're dealing with vulnerable people in both groups, very vulnerable people. So the absolute percentages are high. At least to me they are. 18.8% and 12.5% are high. But those are the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. And still, natural immunity is better at protecting those than vaccination when they're compared head to head.
All right, last topic we only have a few minutes left. Last topic was something you discovered very interesting. This has to do with the Department of Defense, and this furthers the discussion on natural immunity. And again, let me say that this state government, this director of health, I heard Dr. Chan on with Matt Allen last week. He's part of the COVID response team in this state. Repeatedly asked and repeatedly poo-pooing the relevance of natural immunity and that you still need to get a vaccine, even though we have showed compelling evidence here that that's not the case. But it seemed as if at one point that the Department of Defense even agreed with you, but then something happened. So let's start with phase one, right? Let me share this. So here is portions of a memo from a Department of Defense, the initial memo.
Let me clarify. These are their standard existing recommendations.
Okay.
Pre-COVID.
Okay.
Now, a news report which fooled me and fooled itself, and got out there on August 25th, took these standard exemptions and said, well, it looks like they're going to apply to COVID as well. And
we'll talk about the exemption. Talk about
this. These are the classical immunology exemptions. Like, for example, CDC published a memo in 2009 that because remember there was pretty much two waves of H1N1 too, although the second wave was kind of a bust. But thankfully, if you got infected in the first wave, when the recommendations came out about, by the time the vaccine was ready, potentially for the second wave, they said, well, if you got infected in the first wave, basically you really didn't need the vaccine. I mean, that was their recommendation as recently as 2009 to 10. So that's been the standard recommendation. What you're scrolling down to is right, but then when the memo comes out, as if all the science has magically changed and transformed itself, and I think it's just under pressure from the CDC and the CDC Lysenko.
Political pressure.
Yeah, it's the Lysenkoism that we're experiencing right now in real time. The Trofim has long passed away. Stalin is gone, but we have our own Lysenkoists. So those with previous COVID-19 infection are not considered fully vaccinated. And of course, you have to be fully vaccinated to be to stay in the military.
So there's different words, but it's really saying the same thing. Before, they're saying if you had to have the virus before, right, you're considered immune. Here they play with the words. Well, you might be immune, but you're not considered fully vaccinated. I mean, come on.
I mean, obviously you're not vaccinated if you're not vaccinated. I mean, but the point is that they used to grant that as a logical medical exemption if you'd been previously infected. And now all of a sudden, we're supposed to think that immunology has been turned on its head. And what makes it worse, you could have, let's say the vaccine, magically had appeared very early in the pandemic, which of course just doesn't really happen. But regardless, when you weren't sure about the relative strength of natural immunity, maybe you could have suggested something like that. But Mike, we have, I mean, there is a plethora of data now in well over 10 million people, which shows that natural immunity is at least as robust, probably more enduring. And now increasing evidence is emerging. And Israel is not alone. That was the classic study, the study from the Maccabi HMO, 7-fold greater in terms of preventing clinical infection, 6.7-fold greater in terms of preventing hospitalization, because they had a larger data set to look at hospitalizations and a longer follow-up period. But there are comparable data, at least in terms of infection, from Qatar and from Sweden. And beyond those studies, there's at least 20 clinical epidemiologic studies to show that natural immunity is at least as good. Then there's at least 20 studies in the laboratory where they're looking at the diversity and the strength of the natural immune response versus the vaccine response, and they're showing that it's more robust, more flexible, and probably more enduring.
It's just amazing that we're not having these studies in America because nobody wants.
No, actually, some of the data, the laboratory data has come from the United States. There's been some good studies, but I don't really understand, Mike. Other than the politicization of everything, how they can get away with this. I really don't understand it.
All right, I want to go back. I want to ask you very quickly something I meant to ask you before when we talked about the mom with the mask of her daughter and forced to wear those standard blue paper masks. One of her concerns is that, and of course her child had to wear that mask all day for 6, 7, 8 hours, however long. She's done her own research, and she strongly believes those blue masks have a harmful graphene element to them that could be harmful to kids. Are you familiar with that, and do you want to comment on that?
I'm not familiar with the literature, but I know it exists, and I know there are genuine concerns about it. I also know, because it was suggested that kids wear N95 masks or modified N95 masks. I do know that there was a study that looked directly at measured carbon dioxide. Now, this was with an N95
we talked
mask
about that before,
in children, and the non-invasively measures of carbon dioxide in the mask wearing period went up within 5 minutes.
Right.
Now, I think that the paper masks are so crappy and there's so much space around them. That's why they're useless in terms of infection. But but maybe they're not as bad in terms of making a kid get.
But the graphene, we're not sure about that.
I don't know, but people are concerned about it. That's all I can tell you.
All right, Dr. Bostom, thanks as always. We'll look forward to chatting with you again next week. Great information, great work with the Rep Chippendale and Senator De La Cruz in obtaining and analyzing that information. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, and I hope something will come out of that. I think there's things brewing in terms of what the representatives are doing, and I hope it'll have an impact, particularly on our state healthcare workers, but on everybody.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bostom. So just to wrap up the show, folks. Yesterday I spent a lot of time talking on those executive orders, the ridiculousness of that based on no science. Today we confirm with Dr. Bostom that they have data that goes against the very things they're telling us. What is going on? And there is an answer, folks. There is an answer. And we're going to get into this more next week with a new guest. I think you're really going to enjoy. But you all know this, and I even said it yesterday in my comments. Big money from Big Pharma has bought and sold this people. We know from the HPV debate many years ago, that vaccine, that the state was getting a kickback from Big Pharma, who stood to make millions and hundreds of millions from those forced vaccinations. Now you have hundreds, if not thousands of times that much money to make with forced vaccinations for COVID. This is about money, folks. It's about corruption, folks. It's the only thing that can explain why a government would lie to its people, deceive its people, and keep information from its people is because they have been bought and sold. And I firmly believe that. I can't prove it. No doubt in my mind. It's the only thing that explains they're not incompetent people. They're compromised people. Big difference. Again, you're only hearing this here on In the Dugout. Please subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, so you can get notified of our next upcoming event or show. And again, thanks for joining us today. Thanks to Dr. Bostom. We'll see you next week on In the Dugout.